Take me. She sacrificed her life to become the Alpha King's virgin bride. The crimson cloak hit the stone floor like a wound. No one in the great hall breathed. Sophie stood at the center of it all, chin up, jaw locked, hands pressed flat against her thighs to stop the trembling. The torchlight carved shadows across the faces of 100 wolf lords, all watching, all waiting, all completely still. And then there was him. Alpha King Sean Berglund didn't move from his throne. He didn't have to. His eyes, pale gray, cold as January iron, had already traveled down the length of her body and back up again. Slowly, like a man calculating the price of something he hadn't decided to keep yet. He stood. The crowd parted like water before him. He stopped 6 inches from her face. His breath was warm against her cheek. Pine and smoke and something older, something wolfish. And he reached out one scarred hand toward the collar of her dress. She didn't move. Because she couldn't. Because if he pulled that fabric 1 inch lower, the mark would glow. She has exactly 3 seconds before everything falls apart, and she knows it. Watch her hands. The wagon smelled like wet straw and other girls' fear. Sophie had been sitting on a splintered bench for 9 hours, her wrists bound together with rope thin enough to look ceremonial, but tight enough to be real. Across from her, 3 other young women from neighboring Omega packs kept their eyes down. They had learned somewhere before Sophie that looking up only invited attention. She looked up anyway. Outside the wagon's iron grate window, the Berglund territory rose around them like a jaw closing. Black pine forests on both sides of the road, mountains so tall their peaks disappeared into cloud, and at the center of it all, carved directly into the mountainside itself, the castle. Duskmore. Even the name felt like a warning. Sophie pressed her bound wrists against her stomach, against the mark, feeling the familiar pulse of it beneath the 3 layers of linen she'd wrapped there that morning. It wasn't hot yet. It was only ever hot when he was near. When wolves were near. Which meant she had, at most, minutes before that changed. She thought of her mother. Her mother's hands had been rough. Years of washing other people's clothes rough, broken knuckle rough. But they'd cupped Sophie's face like she was made of temple glass. "You don't have to do this," her mother had whispered. But they both knew that was a lie. Their pack had 12 silver coins left. 12. And Lena, Sophie's younger sister, barely 16, had already caught the eye of the auction collectors twice this season. If Sophie didn't volunteer, they would take Lena. And Lena didn't have a mark to hide. Lena was just soft and sweet and completely dangerously innocent. Sophie was none of those things. Not really, but she could perform them. She'd pressed her mother's hands down gently and leaned close to her ear. "Tell them I went willingly. Tell them the Alpha King himself requested me. Make it sound like an honor." Her mother had started crying. Sophie had not. She'd kissed her sister's forehead in the dark, Lena still sleeping, though unaware, picked up the small cloth satchel with her 3 possessions inside it and walked out the door before she could feel anything complicated about it. The castle gate swallowed them whole. Sophie straightened her spine as the wagon lurched to a stop inside the courtyard. She could feel it already, the pulse, like a coal pressed beneath her ribs, not quite burning yet, but warming. The mark was waking up. Not yet, she told it, the way you'd speak to a dangerous animal. Not yet. Be still. A guard yanked the wagon door open. Cold air hit her like a fist. Out, he said, not unkindly, not kindly either. the word of a man who processed cargo. Sophie stepped down onto Duskmoor's stone courtyard and looked up at the castle, at the black banners with the silver wolf crest snapping in the mountain wind, at the towers that seemed to lean inward like they were watching, and made herself a single, silent promise. She would walk out of this place alive. The mark burned, sudden and sharp, against her ribs. He was already close. The Alpha King hadn't even seen her yet, and her secret was already trying to betray her. How long could she possibly last inside his walls? The inside of Duskmoor was nothing like the outside. Outside was brute force, black stone and iron and mountain wind that hit you like a punishment. But inside was worse because it was almost beautiful. The corridors were tall enough to make Sophie feel like a child, their ceilings lost somewhere in shadow above the reach of the torchlight. Tapestries lined the walls, enormous floor-to-ceiling tapestries woven in deep burgundy and charcoal gray, each one depicting a different wolf hunt, not painted, woven. Thousands of careful threads that somehow captured the exact moment of the kill. The wolf mid-leap, jaws open, eyes bright with something that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human either. Sophie kept her eyes forward and her arms pressed tight against her sides. The mark pulsed once, slow, like a second heartbeat, then settled. He's not this close, she reminded herself. It's just the castle, just the wolves in the walls. The guard ahead of her stopped at a carved oak door and stepped aside without a word. The door swung inward on its own, or nearly, pushed by a small, wiry woman on the other side, who moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had never wasted a single motion in her entire life. "In," the woman said. The bride's chamber was large, firelit, and draped in fabrics that probably cost more than Sophie's entire pack's annual earnings. A bed with 4 carved posts, a copper tub already steaming near the far wall, candles everywhere. On the mantel, on the dresser, clustered on a small table beside a silver mirror that reflected the room back in slightly warped, slightly wrong proportions. The woman with the efficient movements stood in the center of it all and looked Sophie up and down with sharp brown eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "I'm Gretchen," she said. Not hello, not welcome, just the name dropped like a stone. "Head maid of Duskmoor. I've dressed 12 virgin brides for this king." She paused, and the pause was deliberate. None of them lasted past the 3rd moon. Sophie didn't flinch. She'd practiced not flinching. "I understand," she said quietly. Gretchen's eyes narrowed by a fraction, almost imperceptible, but Sophie caught it. And the older woman crossed to the wardrobe without another word, pulling out a dress that made Sophie's breath catch despite everything. It was white. Ceremonial white, but rich. Not the flat, cheap white of Omega linen, but something with depth to it. Layers of silk so fine they moved like water in the firelight. The neckline was modest in the front. But the back was open. "Arms up," Gretchen said. Sophie raised her arms. Slowly, carefully, keeping her left side angled away. The mark lived just below her left collarbone, curving toward her sternum. 3 layers of linen wrap, wound tight before dawn that morning, pressed it flat against her skin. "Don't look left," Sophie thought. "Look at my face. Look at anything else." Gretchen did not look at her face. The woman's hands were fast, practiced, smoothing the ceremonial dress up over Sophie's hips, adjusting the shoulders, tugging the silk flat across her back with the focused attention of someone looking for problems, for imperfections. Because a virgin bride presented with imperfections reflected badly on Gretchen's record, and Gretchen clearly did not have a record of imperfections. Her fingers grazed the edge of the linen wrap. She stopped. Sophie felt the woman's paws like a blade pressed flat against her spine. "What is this?" Gretchen said slowly. Her fingers touched the edge of the wrap again. Not pulling, not yet, but feeling. "Virgin brides are presented clean. No bindings, no—" "It's a wound," Sophie said, immediately, calmly. The lie she'd rehearsed for 3 weeks. "From the wagon. The rope. The collectors bound us too tight and the skin split. I wrapped it myself to keep it from bleeding onto the dress." A beat of silence. Gretchen moved around to face her. The older woman's eyes traveled from Sophie's face, down to her collarbone, back up again, reading her, testing her. Because Gretchen had dressed 12 brides, and she knew what fear looked like, and she knew what lies looked like. And right now, she was deciding which one she was seeing. Sophie held her gaze and thought about her sister sleeping in the dark. She did not blink. Gretchen held the stare for 4 full seconds. Then she turned back to the wardrobe. "I'll have the castle physician look at it after the feast," she said. Her voice returned to its flat, efficient register. "Tonight you wear it as it is. The king doesn't like to be kept waiting for—" The door opened. A castle guard stood in the frame. Broad. Armor polished to a mirror shine. He didn't look at Gretchen. He looked at Sophie, and the look was not unkind, but it was absolute. "The king will not wait for the feast." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Gretchen's hand stilled on the wardrobe door. "The inspection," the guard continued. "He wants it now." The mark ignited, not warming, not pulsing. Burning, a white-hot flare beneath the linen wrap, beneath the ceremonial silk, directly over Sophie's heart. And she pressed her arm against her ribs hard enough to feel her own pulse hammering against her palm. He was already moving toward her. Gretchen almost found it. The guard just announced there's no more time. And somewhere in this castle, Sean Berglund is walking down a corridor right now, getting closer with every second. Think about that. She hasn't even met him yet, and she's already losing. The feast hadn't even begun. The ceremony hadn't started. He hadn't given her a single hour to prepare. And the mark on her skin was burning bright enough that she was terrified to look down at her own chest. Because what if it was already visible through the silk? The study smelled wrong. Sophie registered it the moment the guard pushed the door open and stepped aside. A sharp, clean scent that cut straight through the wood smoke and candle wax, straight through the perfume Gretchen had pressed into her collarbone with 2 efficient fingers, straight through everything. It smelled like the sea, like salt flats baking under a white summer sun, like something scraped from the bottom of the world and set on fire. Wolf salt. She knew the name. Every Omega child did. Whispered between mothers and daughters the way you whispered about knives and deep water. Wolf salt reveals what wolves try to hide. It was burned in braziers during pack tribunals, during territory disputes, during the kind of ceremonies where someone always ended up bleeding. It was burning now, in 2 iron braziers flanking the far wall, their smoke curling upward in thin gray ribbons toward the vaulted ceiling. He was already testing her, and she hadn't even seen him yet. Sophie made herself walk forward. The study was not what she'd expected. No throne, no ceremony. Just a room that felt lived in by someone who didn't believe in comfort. A massive oak desk buried under maps and correspondence. Bookshelves that covered every wall from floor to ceiling. A fire burning low in a stone hearth wide enough to park the auction wagon inside. And standing at the far window, his back to her, was Sean Berglund. He was larger than the stories. She'd heard the stories. Every pack had them, traded like currency across territory lines. The Alpha King is 7 feet of cold fury. The Alpha King broke a beta's spine with one hand for looking at his maps. The Alpha King hasn't smiled since his mate died, and he never will again. She'd filed those stories under useful fear and moved on. But standing here, in the actual room, with the actual man, he wore the crimson cloak over bare shoulders. Just that. The cloak was extraordinary up close. Deep, arterial red. The velvet so thick it absorbed the firelight instead of reflecting it. But trimmed at the edges with dark fur that looked soft enough to be worth more than her village. It hung from his shoulders like it had been built there, and beneath it, his back was all muscle and old scars. 4 diagonal lines running from his left shoulder blade toward his spine, the kind of marks that came from another wolf's claws and spoke to a fight that someone else had not survived. He turned around. His eyes were the color she'd been told, pale gray, like ice over a winter river. But the stories hadn't mentioned the way they moved, cataloging, dissecting. The eyes of a man who had been lied to many times and had developed a clinical, almost bored relationship with detecting it. He picked up the silver inspection blade from the desk without looking at it. It was slender, more like a letter opener than a weapon, a stublet made of pure silver that caught the wolf salt smoke and gleamed cold and absolute in the firelight. He said nothing. He crossed the room. Sophie locked her knees. The mark was screaming now. No longer burning, it had moved past burning into something that felt almost electrical. A current running from her collarbone to her sternum, and she could feel the linen wrap growing warm against her skin, and she thought with extraordinary calm, if this wrap shows through the silk, I am already dead. He stopped in front of her. 6 inches, the same distance as the great hall. His breath hit her cheek, pine and smoke, and something dark underneath, something that was wolf in the most fundamental sense of the word. And she stared at a fixed point past his left shoulder and breathed through her nose in slow, measured counts. 1, 2, 3. He lifted the silver blade. The flat of the blade was cold, shockingly cold. The cold of something that had no business being at room temperature. A cold that went straight through the thin ceremonial fabric and pressed against the skin just below her right collarbone. Goosebumps erupted from that point outward, cascading down her arm, across her chest, up the back of her neck, every hair on her body standing to attention as the silver traced a slow, deliberate path along the neckline of her dress. Not left, she thought desperately. Stay right. Don't go left. His eyes hadn't moved from her face. That was somehow the most terrifying part. He wasn't watching the blade. He wasn't watching her dress. He was watching her face with those ice-gray eyes. And as she stood there with every muscle pulled wire-tight, trying to hold her expression in the neutral territory between fear and guilt, she saw it happen. His eyes shifted. Not dramatically. Not like something from a story. Just a subtle darkening at the edges. The pale gray bleeding slowly, almost lazily, toward amber. The color of a wolf's eyes in the dark. He could smell it. He could smell her fear. Sean's head snapped toward the window. The blade dropped from her dress. Sophie took one involuntary step backward, her heel catching the edge of a floor stone, her hand flying out to catch the desk beside her. And for 1 half second, she looked down. The linen wrap was still white. The mark had not broken through. Not yet. Sean turned back to her. The amber was already fading from his eyes, the gray returning, colder now and sharper. He looked at her hand, still gripping the desk edge, and then at her face, and something moved behind his expression. Something that wasn't warmth, but wasn't entirely calculation either. Something curious. "Don't move," he said. His voice was the first she'd heard from him. Low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise it because volume was a tool for people who weren't certain they'd be obeyed. He crossed to the window in 4 strides, looked down into the courtyard, and was still. Right now, in this exact moment, she has maybe 30 seconds while his back is turned. 30 seconds to adjust the wrap, to press the mark down, to buy herself 1 more hour of survival. But here's what I need you to think about. Would you move? Would you risk him turning around and catching you? Would you stay completely still and pray? Because that is the choice she's making right now, and there is no good answer. Sophie did not move. She stood exactly where he'd left her, one hand still on the desk edge, the mark burning its silent, furious burn beneath 3 layers of linen and silk, and she watched the broad line of his scarred back and his crimson cloak, and made her decision. She would not run. She would not flinch. She would make him believe she had absolutely nothing to hide. Sean turned from the window. His eyes found her immediately, still standing, still steady, hand still on the desk. Something shifted in his jaw, a micro-expression, gone before it fully arrived. He picked up the silver blade from where it had fallen. "Where were we?" he said. It wasn't a question. He hadn't stopped the inspection. The crash outside had given her 10 seconds. Not freedom. And now he was walking back toward her with the silver blade, and the wolf salt smoke was thickening in the room, and the mark beneath her wrap was burning so hot she was terrified he could already see it glowing through the silk. A secret made of light, impossible to hide in a room designed to find exactly that. He didn't go for her collarbone. Sophie had braced for it, had spent the 3 seconds of his approach recalculating the angle of her body, deciding which way to turn, how much of a natural protest she could mount without looking like she was protecting something specific. And then the silver blade bypassed her neckline entirely and dropped, cold and deliberate, to her wrist. The one gripping the desk. The flat of the blade pressed beneath her hand and lifted it, gently, with a clinical precision that was somehow more frightening than force would have been, turning her wrist upward until the rope burns caught the firelight. He looked at them for a long moment. The burns were real. At least that much wasn't a lie. The auction collectors had bound them tight enough to leave marks. 4 days of wagon travel etched into her skin in thin red lines that had only just stopped weeping. She'd used them deliberately in her story to Gretchen, and she'd felt no guilt about it because guilt was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. Sean's thumb, bare, no blade now, just the rough pad of his thumb, traced one line from her wrist to her palm. She felt it everywhere. Not in the way the stories described. Not warmth. Not electricity. Nay, not the ridiculous moon-blessed pull of the mate bond that the older women in her pack still whispered about over their mending. Just a simple, devastating awareness. The way your entire body orients toward a sound in the dark before your mind catches up and names it. Dangerous, her mind said, catching up. Very, her body agreed. The firelight moved across his crimson cloak in slow waves, the deep red going darker in the shadows, almost black at the edges, then flaring back to that arterial, urgent red when the flames steadied. The fur trim at his shoulders caught the light differently, each individual strand holding its own small flame, and Sophie found herself thinking, absurdly, that it was the most expensive thing she had ever stood next to. He was still holding her wrist. He leaned in, not quickly, not aggressively, the way a wolf approaches something it hasn't decided about yet, with patience and with the absolute confidence of something that knows nothing in the vicinity is faster than it is. His mouth stopped at her ear. When he spoke, she felt it before she heard it, a low vibration that started somewhere in his chest and traveled through the 6 inches of air between them and landed in her sternum like a struck bell, resonating downward through her ribs, her stomach, all the way to the floor. "You smell like wolf salt," he said quietly, "and terror." A pause, long enough that she almost breathed. "But you don't smell like a virgin." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Sophie's mind moved fast, faster, cycling through responses, discarding them, building and collapsing arguments in the space of a single second. Deny it. Deflect. Give him the wounded look, the trembling lip, the performance of innocence that had worked on the collectors and on Gretchen, and on every wolf who'd underestimated what an Omega girl could teach herself to become when survival was the only available curriculum. His eyes were amber now, fully. The gray had burned away entirely, replaced by that deep predatory gold, and he was watching her face with an expression she couldn't name, because it wasn't anger, and it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't the cold calculation from the Great Hall. It was fascination, like a man who had been handed what he expected to be a simple puzzle, and had just discovered it had significantly more pieces than the box suggested. She opened her mouth. The door exploded open. A guard, not the polished ceremonial one from before, but a soldier, a real armor with real damage on it, a fresh cut above his eyebrows still bleeding freely, stopped in the doorframe and looked at Sean with the focused urgency of a man delivering news that cannot wait for anything. "My king." Sean had already straightened, already released her wrist. The amber was draining from his eyes, not slowly this time, but fast, tactical, the wolf receding behind the king. And he was turning toward the guard with a stillness that was somehow more alarming than motion. "The east gate," the soldier said, breathing hard. "Someone came through the wards." A beat. "He's not one of ours." Sean turned back to Sophie. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, those cooling gray eyes traveling from her face to her wrist, to her collarbone and back. And then he set the silver blade down on the desk beside her hand. Carefully, precisely, like a bookmark, like a promise. "I'll finish this later. Don't leave this room," he said. And then he was gone, the crimson cloak sweeping through the doorframe, the soldier pulling the door behind them, and the latch clicked shut, and Sophie was alone with the wolf salt smoke, and the dying fire, and the silver blade lying next to her hand like an unanswered question. She looked down at her wrist, at the place his thumb had been. Then she pressed her palm hard against the mark and felt it burning, steady and deep and rhythmic, like a second heartbeat that belonged to someone else entirely. He didn't say he knew. He didn't say he'd found anything. But that line, "You don't smell like a virgin," wasn't about her innocence. He's been in that room with wolf salt burning for 20 minutes. He's an alpha king. He smells everything. Which means the real question isn't what he found. It's what he's decided to do about it. The blade was still warm from his hand. The mark was still burning beneath hers. And somewhere on the other side of Duskmoor's east gate, someone had just walked through the king's wards uninvited. The only kind of wolf who could do that was one powerful enough not to care about the consequences. And Sophie, standing alone in the study with the wolf salt thickening around her, had a terrible, stomach-dropping feeling that she already knew exactly who it was. Sophie didn't stay in the center of the room. She crossed to the window. She knew it was exactly what he'd told her not to do, and she did it anyway, because "don't leave this room" was the instruction of a man who expected obedience. Them and Sophie had been performing obedience for 4 days, while privately making every decision herself, and she wasn't about to stop now. She pressed her back against the stone wall beside the window frame and looked down into the courtyard. He was already inside the outer wall. She saw him immediately. Not because he was the largest man in the courtyard, though he was, and not because of the silver armor that caught the torchlight and threw it back in cold, contemptuous flashes, but because of the stillness around him. Sean's soldiers had formed a perimeter 10 feet out, and not one of them was moving. They were holding position the way you hold position around something you're not certain you can stop. The rival alpha stood at the center of that stillness, like he'd been there for years. He was pale where Sean was dark. Leaner. But constructed along lines that suggested the leanness was a choice rather than a limitation. All sharp angles and controlled, coiled energy, like a blade that had been made narrow on purpose. His cloak was black. His pack markings, silver, geometric, ancient, ran up his neck and disappeared into his jaw. He looked up, not at Sean, at the study window. "I'll make this simple," he said. His voice carried. Not loudly. He didn't raise it, but it carried the way thunder carries, through the ground as much as through the air, and every soldier in the courtyard heard it, without it being intended for any of them. "Send out Isolde," he said, "and I'll leave without burning your east wing." Isolde. The name hit Sophie like the flat of a blade across the sternum. Not Sophie. Isolde. The name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 4 years. The name that existed only in documents she'd burned and memories she'd buried under layers of careful, practiced reinvention. Her true name, the one given to her at birth by a mother who had known, even then, what the mark on her daughter's skin would eventually mean. Her hand flew to the window frame. Sean hadn't moved. He stood with his back to the castle, facing the rival, and Sophie watched the set of his shoulders in the torchlight. That particular stillness she was already learning to read. The stillness that wasn't calm, but was calculation. And she saw the exact moment it happened. The moment he understood. His head turned, not toward the rival, not toward his soldiers, but back toward the castle. Backing up, tilting at the precise angle required to find the study window on the 3rd floor. His eyes found her immediately. Across the courtyard. Across the torchlight and the smoke and the 30 feet of freezing mountain air between them. Those pale gray eyes. Not amber now. Not cold calculation now. But something she had no word for yet. Something that lived in the space between threat and discovery. Locked onto hers with an accuracy that felt less like coincidence and more like he'd always known exactly where she'd be standing. He looked at her like she was a map he'd just learned to read. Like she was a weapon he'd just realized he was already holding. Sophie did not look away. She felt it before she saw it. A pressure behind her ribs. Not the burning, not the pulse. Something new. Something that moved. She looked down. Through the silk of the ceremonial dress. Through the linen wrap. Out through everything she'd layered between herself and discovery, a light. Gold. Warm. Moving. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and felt it there. Felt the mark extending, reaching, tendrils of heat crawling up from her ribs toward the center of her chest in slow, deliberate pulses, like roots growing toward water, like something ancient recognizing something it had been looking for. No, she thought. The mark had never moved before. It had burned. It had pulsed. It had woken and slept and terrified her in its stillness. But it had never moved, never reached, never behaved like something with an intention. She pressed harder. It pushed back. Her knees hit the floor. She came here to save her sister. She ended up becoming the weapon that will burn both kingdoms to the ground. And the worst part? She's starting to want to. The door swings open. It is not Sean,